Because of course, Nicholas III was too young to have known St. Francis, and therefore he says, "We, growing up in that time, have discussed the very rule and holy intention of Blessed Francis himself in frequent collation with a few companions of this confessor, to whom his life and conversation were known." Very much so like Gregory IX. As far as Nicholas is concerned, there is the text, the Franciscan Rule, the author, St. Francis, and the goal is to achieve, to understand the authorial intent. And he, through acquaintance, through mediator, can bypass, he argues, the text and reach the authorial intent. Now, parallel to this tendency, there was a growing point of view which opposed the idea of interpretation, opposed the idea that authorial intent is what matters and that we can bypass it. The key text for this point of view was something St. Francis himself said. In a way, his authorial intent spoken through him. St. Francis, after he was no longer the head of the order, wrote his testament. And in it, St. Francis prohibited the friars from adding interpretations, glossa, to the rule and from saying thus it is to be understood. Furthermore, he calls on the friars, the readers, to understand his text, the rule, simply and without interpretation, just as he argues it was instructed to him by God. Now, at the same time that we have these texts dealing directly with the question of interpretation, as we saw in the timeline, we also had intense hagiographical text. We had a lot of texts telling the life of the saint, in this case, the founder of the order, Saint Francis. One of such texts is the Compilatio Assisiensis, into which we're now going to dwell. So the Compilatio Assisiensis is first found in record in a codex called Perugia 1046, dated to the early 14th century. Now, this quite large codex begins with the rule, followed by papal bulls, two of which we have seen, then the official life of Saint Francis, and towards the end, we have a group of untitled stories about Saint Francis. These stories, of course, are the Compilatio Assisiensis. Now, this codicological context invites the reader of the text at the time to read these stories in the context or through the lenses of the interpretational debate. The stories is relatively a small corpus, covering about 30 folios and compounding 117 stories. There is no certain thematical order or a grand narrative that follows these stories. They seem a bit more collective. There is a repeating phrase throughout the stories, which is "we who were with him," meaning Saint Francis. Thus, the text self-identifies as first-hand eyewitness. Now, beside the focus on St. Francis's holiness and character, just like any other hagiographical text, these stories in a unique way also deal with the question of interpretation. I wish to show you that in two examples. One story in which authorial intent is dealt with directly is the following. When a certain brother, Licerio, was with St. Francis, he spoke to him about certain matters, and he also asked him a question. It is phrased complicatly, so I'll say the question is basically, can friars, can Franciscans, who are also clerics, have books as long as they say that these books belong to the Franciscan order? Thus, Licerio asked, "Tell me, Father, when you first began to have brothers, what was your intention, and what is it today, and what do you believe it will be until the day of your death? Because I want to be sure of your intention and of your first and last wish." Then the question, may we cleric brothers who have many books keep them as long as we say that they belong to the order? St. Francis answers him by telling him that, "I tell you, brother, that it has been and is my first and last intention and will, if the brothers would only heed it, that no brother should have anything except a tunic, as our rule allows us, together with a cord and underwear." So we have seen in this story two characters, Richerio and St. Francis. And these characters represent 2 points of view. Richerio represents the point of view which argues, like the popes we have seen, that there is a text, there is authorial intent, and they're not one and the same. Authorial intent, being human, can change through time. That is why Richerio, who obviously knows the text, goes to the source, to the author, and tries to understand the authorial intent and how it has changed. St. Francis, on the other hand, in his answer, rejects this whole notion. He presents a contradictory point of view. He unifies the text and the authorial intent. He explains that his will is the text, as our rule allows us. He nullifies his position in a way by saying our rule and not my rule. St. Francis puts himself just like any other friar who is under the rule. Turning to him is of no value because his authorial intent is what the text said. Therefore, if you wish to understand, if Richerio really wanted to understand St. Francis's wish according to this text, he should have just gone to the text. This is why St. Francis sends him back to the text. So in this story, we see the character of St. Francis as the author of the text in question, the rule, explaining through interaction his personal point of view on the question of authorial intent and of his understanding of how we should read and how we should interpret. There's another story in which the question of interpretation rises, yet in that case, St. Francis is no longer the author. One of the stories in the Compilatio describes the process of writing the rule. It says that when Blessed Francis was on a mountain with certain brothers in order to write the rule, a great many ministers gathered around Brother Elias, a certain key figure in the Franciscan order. When Brother Elias, with those ministers, was near the place where Blessed Francis was staying, he called him. Blessed Francis responded, and seeing those ministers, he said, "What do these brothers want?" "These are ministers," Brother Elias answered, "who heard that you're making a new rule. They fear that you're making it very harsh, and they say publicly, that they refuse to be bound by it. Make it for yourself and not for them, they say." Then Blessed Francis turned his face to heaven and spoke to Christ in this way. "Lord, didn't I tell you they wouldn't believe you?" The voice of Christ was then heard in the air saying, "Francis, nothing of yours is in the rule. Whatever is there is all mine. And I want the rule observed in this way. To the letter, to the letter, to the letter, and without a gloss, without a gloss, without a gloss." Then Blessed Francis turned to the brothers and said, "Did you hear? Did you hear? Do you want me to have you told again?" Then the ministers, confused and blaming themselves, departed. So in this somewhat wonderfully written story, we see the question of authorial intent dealt with, yet with another author. So the ministers turn to St. Francis and they wish to change the text. They turn to the author in order to change the text. Yet St. Francis puts himself aside, and the story portrays Christ as the real author of the text. Not only is St. Francis not the author in this story, but Christ, in the role of an author, also explains how he wishes his own text, the rule, to be understood. Christ wants the text to be understood literally and without interpretation. This threefold repetition, ad literam, ad literam, ad literam, is reminiscent of the famous "a rose is a rose is a rose," the time when a text wishes to become what it is representing. Yet, of course, in this case, the text, the story, is trying to represent another text, the rule. We also see here the idea of the text being, the rule being unobservable, which we have seen in the bull dealt with through putting the words into the mouth of Christ. So in this case, St. Francis is no longer the author, and the author himself also unifies himself with his text. We see here the continuation of this phenomenon of texts mirroring texts. So if at the beginning we had a rule sending the reader back to the gospel, then we had a testament sending the reader back to the rule, observe the rule, literally. Now we have stories sending the reader back to the text and telling the reader to understand it ad litteram and sine glosse, simply to the letter and without interpretation. So if we see the Compilatio in the bigger context of the Franciscan interpretational debate, we can see that the interpretational debate occurs in two main fields. There is the normative field, in which the writer is talking about authority intent. So we have the testament, we have commentators who say this is how we should understand, this was actually the meaning, they talk about it directly. And then we have practice. We have a vast amount of hagiography, of stories about the life of Saint Francis, through which we should take precedence. We should look at their life and say, okay, this is the way we should live, and therefore this is the right interpretation. The Compilatio is somewhat in between those two. On one hand, it is a story, it is a part of hagiography, it's a story about the founder. But it doesn't want us just to see how St. Francis lived. It wants to allow St. Francis to refer explicitly to his intention, to talk about how St. Francis, the author, saw authorial intent. Now, this is parallel to how scholars turn to the question of interpretation as a historical object. How do we study how people regarded and understood texts? So scholars today can turn to normative texts. They can see how people talked about interpretation in mainly in the theological discourse, how text, the Bible in that case, should be understood. They can also turn to practice to see actual interpretation, to see commentaries, either of the Bible or the rule. In this case, it will be the same, and to see what they've done, and from that deduct what was their understanding. But the Compilatio offers us another way. It offers us a narrative text, a story, in which we see characters who are said to have talked about interpretation. We see the historical figure as literary figures talking about interpretation. And through these stories, we can see the point of view it is representing, the understanding of interpretation, of author, of reading, and of authorial intent, which is representing the view at the time. So the Compilatio offers us a third angle, a third way of breaching into the mind of the reader of the 13th and 14th century reader, and to see how he thought of texts, of authors, and of interpretations. Thank you very much.